Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you've had a fantastic week. We have been praying for you guys, and we didn't receive such good news this past week. You might have heard from Doug that the embassy in Johannesburg sent an email back to Senator Merkley's office, basically saying that they cannot give us an expedited interview date. Because there's apparently some form of queue, and they've got to follow the queue, and it's unfair to those who are before us in the queue. You know, there's nothing we can do about that. That's just something that we've got to accept. However, we're happy that at least we've got somebody that's going to be in touch with the embassy in Johannesburg for us through the senator's office, and that's going to keep us updated. And so we still don't have a clear answer as to when we can have that interview. But by the way that I'm keeping track of dates, it still doesn't seem too far for us to have our interview. Other than that, we've had a week and a half at home so far, and it has been crazy. I don't have the kids here today. I had to record this morning while the kids are gone, and so I wanted to show their faces to you, but I'll still try to find a way to get them onto some of the video that I sent to you. Other than that, please know that we are just a message away, either on Facebook or WhatsApp. We got email. If there's anything that we can pray for you about, please do that. The more people we have spread out across the world praying for some of the things that's taking place, the more we can reach to God from different angles, and I do believe that has an impact on having our concerns heard. And so I'm going to talk this evening about, the title is An Empty Life. An Empty Life. I want to just go back. You know, I know that a few years ago, I think about 3 years ago, I did a series on Ecclesiastes. I just want to spend some time there again. It's just been something on my heart, and a few things that I thought, it's very basic, but I thought it might be cool to just touch base on that again. And I just want to remind you quickly about what Ecclesiastes is about. It's a very interesting read. If you've never read Ecclesiastes, then I would really challenge you to go and read it. It's interesting to read, but it's not easy to understand. I remember sending the book to, or telling somebody that wasn't a Christian yet to read the book, and she read it, and she said she just read a few chapters, and she eventually gave up. She said, no, I don't know how to handle this book. It seems different. It seems like a different type of book than what we would expect to be in the Bible. Well, why? You know, it lies in the development of Israelite wisdom tradition. Okay? Now, wisdom is the skill of life, right? The skill to deal with people, to deal with the world, and to deal with God. And in order to acquire such skill, one has to observe regular patterns of human behavior from which one can make conclusive observations. Like, for example, when you look at what's happening in the world, you might reach the conclusion that says, you know, good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. And we could say, well, that's wisdom. We've observed human behavior, and we've come to the conclusion that usually when something bad happens to somebody, it's because that person was a bad person. Now, the book of Proverbs is such a type of book. It's sort of an observational analysis of human behavior, and then it makes conclusions on that and puts it down into words. Now, so that's what we call the first stage of Israelite wisdom tradition. But there's a second stage of wisdom development that we find in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's like a follow-up exploration. It's like this type of wisdom that says, okay, so this is what was observed previously. Okay, previously we observed and we sort of concluded that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. But let's reevaluate that. Let's think about that again, because that doesn't seem to always work and to make sense. And so Ecclesiastes sort of challenges, in a way, some of the earlier ideas that's written in the proverbial tradition. Let me give you an example. Ecclesiastes says, good things happen to bad people, and bad things happen to good people. Do you get the difference? Ecclesiastes says, no, it's actually not that true. We can't say that always it's the case that good things happen to bad people. No. Sometimes bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. So Ecclesiastes sort of opposes Proverbs almost in a way. It is a reaction against the old wisdom tradition. Okay, the old wisdom tradition tries to give answers to life. Ecclesiastes tells us that when you look at life, there are more questions than answers. Okay, and that a lot of things we cannot understand. The whole Old Testament is about faith. Ecclesiastes is about doubt. The whole Old Testament depicts the presence of God. Ecclesiastes gives us a picture of life without God. The key theme in Ecclesiastes is what? You know what it is, right? The key word is vanity. And vanity literally means a puff of air. Everything is meaningless. A chasing after the wind, Solomon says. Everything under the sun is vanity. What Solomon is really saying is this. If God does not exist and is not a part of your life, then life is a puff of air. Absolutely meaningless. And so this is a profound book. I think that one can recommend to an atheist, to somebody who does not believe in God, because many of the things that Ecclesiastes says is absolutely true for those who believe in a world without God. Now, with that said, the title of tonight's lesson is Empty Life. A full life is what we all desire. If you ask young people leaving school what they would like to do with their lives, you hear answers like, you know what, I want to travel the world, or I want to live comfortably. That's code language for I want lots of money. Or I want to get my doctorate degree, be an expert in a specific field. Or I want to buy a house and a car and get a neat husband and wife and have kids. Or, you know what, I want to live a long and healthy life with my family. We then assume that if I have all these things and do all these things in my life, that I will have a full life. That's the assumption. Solomon says, these things don't make a full life. In actual fact, people who live their lives with these goals in mind, in reality live empty lives. Now, what is an empty life according to Solomon? Let's start with a life of travel. Some people say, I want to travel the world. You know, the more places I see, the more full my life will be. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 8-b says, the eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its full of hearing. You can never see enough. Proverbs 27:20 says, the eyes of man are never satisfied. You know, if we could, some people have the conceptual idea that if we could take a selfie by the Great Pyramids, jog on the Great Wall of China, and swim in the waters of the Niagara Falls, then we will be filled. We've traveled the world. We've seen the world. Ladies and gentlemen, seeing the world does not satisfy our souls. We will always want to see something else and something new. So a life of travel, Solomon says, that's probably not going to cut it for you. What about a life of fame? If you're famous, will that fill you? In chapter 1, verse 11, Solomon says, there is no remembrance of men of old, and even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. Everyone will be forgotten. Fame is temporary and empty. Some people are remembered longer than others, but everyone is eventually forgotten. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 16 says, I thought to myself, look how I've grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. In chapter 2 verse 9 he says, I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 29 to 34, we see the text tells us that Solomon was wiser than any man in the known world of the time. He spoke 3,000 proverbs and composed 1,005 songs. He had knowledge of animals and plants. People from all nations came to listen to him. He was world famous. Yet he says, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Solomon looks at his fame and he says, it's all meaningless, all a waste of time. Ladies and gentlemen, fame does not satisfy your soul. What about a life of study? I can get a doctorate degree in something. Solomon says in chapter 1 verse 18, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Of making many books, there's no end. And much study wearies the body. That's in chapter 12 verse 12. You can never study enough or know enough. The more you know, the more grief you have. What you study or write eventually becomes outdated. Sigmund Freud, for example, he's the father of psychology. He is studied in every psychology course, but no psychologist actually believes in his theories anymore. Knowledge does not satisfy your soul. It's only something that fills your mind. What about a life of pleasure? What about a life of pleasure? Let's see what Solomon says about that. In chapter 2, verse 1 to 3, and verse 8b and verse 10. I'm just giving you some interjecting texts. He says, I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. I tried cheering myself with wine. I acquired men and women singers, and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure, but that also proved to be meaningless. The pleasures of life do not satisfy our souls. There's always a better car, a better husband, better wife, better woman, better man, a better roller coaster, another opportunity to get drunk, a better drug. Pleasures never get satisfied. There's always better food. They only inspire you to live for the next pleasure. Every pleasure comes to an end. Every pleasure inspires you to find another pleasure that will not satisfy you. It's exactly like drug usage. And Solomon talks about that in chapter 6 verse 7. All man's efforts are for his mouth, yet his appetite is never satisfied. But what about a life of wealth? Certainly a life of wealth is not an empty life. That is a full life. You got lots of money, then, it must go well with you, with your soul. Chapter 2 verse 4 to 8 says the following, I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. Like the other things, Solomon found wealth to be meaningless. Wealth does not satisfy our souls. And he gives a few reasons throughout the book as to why that is his opinion. In chapter 2 verse 18 to 19 he says, well, having a lot of wealth is not a good idea because you would have to leave it behind for somebody coming after you. And how would you know if that person is wise or not? How do you know if that person deserves the money or not? And if you look at what happened to Rehoboam and Jeroboam and what happened to Solomon's children, they were not very wise. Chapter 5 verse 10, he says, one never has enough of it. So it's not wise to continually look for it because you're never going to have enough. In chapter 5 verse 15, he says, you cannot carry your wealth in your hands and take it with you when you die. And so he gives us good reasons why a life of wealth doesn't fill your life. In chapter 2 verse 14 to 16, we see Solomon talks about wisdom. If I have wisdom, will that fill my life? Will that make me feel full? Chapter 2 verse 14, 16 says the same fate overtakes both the fool and the wise man. Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said in my heart, this too is meaningless. For the wise man, like the fool, will not long be remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man must too die. So, a life of wisdom doesn't fill you. What about the last thing? What about a life of family and health? Certainly, a life of family and health will fill every person, right? In chapter 6 verse 3, Solomon says, a man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive a proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. In verse 9, even if he lives 1,000 years twice over, but fails to enjoy his prosperity, he does it full. We spoke about it, I think, not too long ago. Family is a temporary invention of God for planet Earth to inform us of a greater reality found in heaven. Health on earth is also temporarily, but we all eventually die. Now let me summarize Solomon's observations. You can see and experience the greatest places on planet Earth. You can have the greatest name of all people on the earth that have ever lived. You can have a mind filled with knowledge. You can have access to the greatest pleasures of the body. You can have all the stuff in the world you desire and have the biggest bank balance. You can carry wisdom. You can live for 2,000 years and have many children, and yet your life can be empty. You see, what you see, who you are, what you know, what you experience, and what you have does not satisfy your soul. Solomon had all these things, and he concluded, "So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." That's in chapter 2, verse 17. Let me get to the crux. You might be sitting here tonight in disagreement with Solomon. Sure, traveling, fame, knowledge, pleasure, wealth, wisdom, health, and family does bring a certain measure of fulfillment in a person's life. It might seem like Solomon is talking nonsense. Therefore, it's important to understand the criteria by which Solomon judges the fullness of a life. There are only two things that can make your life full. It's joy and eternal gain, in my perspective. Joy and eternal gain. A life without the presence of joy is an empty life. A life without the presence of joy is an empty life. In chapter 6, verse 3, remember what he says. A man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive a proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he, even if he lives 1,000 years twice over but fails to enjoy his prosperity. Do you see there? You can have everything in the world, but if you do not enjoy it, your life is meaningless. Chapter 8 verse 15, and so I commend the enjoyment of life, because nothing is better for a man under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany him in his work all the days of life that God has given him under the sun. Chapter 2, 24, 3, 12 to 13, verse 22, chapter 5 verse 18, all say the same thing. Eat and drink and enjoy your work. Chapter 9 verse 7 to 9 says enjoy the basics of life, wine, food, and your family. Chapter 2:23 and chapter 4 verse 8. If you don't enjoy what you're doing, your life on earth is meaningless. You are like a slave in this world. The text says all his days work is pain and grief. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. It's the idea that you eat, sleep, work, repeat. You're a slave. Eat, sleep, work, repeat. That's not a life of joy. Chapter 11 verse 8 to 10. He tells young people to be happy. Let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Banish anxiety from your hearts. And he concludes, however many years a man may live, let him enjoy them all. That's in chapter 11 verse 8. Now let's bring this home. On a scale from 1 to 10, how much are you enjoying your life at the moment? How much joy do you have? If joy is low on your scale, you have a problem with God, and God has a problem with you. Solomon says there's only one way to live a life of joy. Let me read it to you. Chapter 2, verse 24 to 25. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat and find enjoyment? Without him. Chapter 3, verse 12 to 13. I know that there is nothing better for men than to be happy and do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. Chapter 5 verse 19 to 20 says, Moreover, when God gives any man wealth and possessions and enables him to enjoy them, to accept his lot and be happy in his work, this is a gift of God. He seldom reflects on the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with gladness of heart. Where does this joy come from? It comes from God. You cannot have a fulfilled life on earth without God. He brings the joy, right? Joy is a fruit of the Spirit that is defined as happiness regardless of circumstances. We've spoken about that, right? Joy comes from God. Therefore, the absence of joy from your life means that God is absent from your life. That's hard to hear, but it's true. And if you don't have joy, you're currently living an empty life because you're disconnected from the Creator. You are wasting your time and energy on this planet. Secondly, a life that does not produce eternal gain is empty. It's an empty life. Solomon starts off Ecclesiastes in verse 3 by asking the question, what does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? He's not talking about earthly gain. When you read the book properly, you come to see that death is a very real theme for Solomon. The gain he's talking about is the gain you make after you're dead. In other words, seeing the pyramids, running on the Great Wall of China, swimming in the waters of the Niagara has no gain for you if you die today. Fame on earth does not give you gain if you die today. Being famous on earth means nothing to the afterlife. The question is, are you famous in heaven? A brain pumped full of knowledge, a PhD, does not bring you any gain if you die today because your brain will literally be eaten by maggots. A life of pleasure brings no gain to you if you die today because your flesh will cease to exist. Wealth is no gain for you if you die today because it stays here when you move along. Family and health has no gain for you if you die today because you enter eternity alone. If you die today, it doesn't matter who you are, what you've seen and experienced, how much you know or what you have seen. The only thing that matters is what you take with you. The only thing you can take with you are the things that impresses God. God will give you nothing in exchange for selfies at the pyramids or a massive bank account or a puffed up mind of knowledge. Steve Jobs maybe is not a role model for us, but he did achieve some stuff on earth, and what he said is true. When he was 17, he read a quote somewhere that says, "Live each day as if it is your last. Someday you will most certainly be right." For his whole life, he has woken up in the morning and asked himself one question as he looks in the mirror. If today was the last day of my life, what would I do? Or would I want to do what I'm about to be doing today? Remember that you will be dead soon. Remembering that you will be dead soon is one of the best ways to live your life. That's how you make sure that you live a full life. So I want to ask you tonight, go home and write down the names of the people that you are busy making an eternal impact on. That is your eternal gain. When you died, God will not ask you, what have you seen? What have you done? What have you studied? Or acquired? Or what have you become? He will ask you, who have you brought with you? That's what we see in the Great Commission. If you cannot provide any names, to a large extent, it shows a disconnect between you and God, and it's connecting you to an empty life. And that might be why you're feeling empty, if you are. The common denominator between joy and eternal gain is God. God is the one that provides joy. God is the one that gives life meaning because He's the only eternal. So when you're connected with Him, you're connected in eternity, and He gives you joy, and that's how your life gets fulfilled. A life apart from God will remain empty. It will remain an empty life. Ecclesiastes 3:11. God has set eternity in the hearts of men. He's placed eternity in us. We know this earth is not supposed to be temporary. Mark Twain said, within the heart of every man there is a God-shaped void that cannot be filled by anything else except God. Sightseeing, popularity, wealth, health, pleasures, and family will not fill the void in your heart. Only God can. That is why people who are poor can have fulfilled lives. That's why people who are sick can have fulfilled lives. That is why people who live in one place their whole lives, never sees anything else, have filled lives. That's why people who cannot experience much of the pleasures of the earth have fulfilled lives. It's not because they have pleasures and all these things. It's because they've got God. God is the only common denominator that will give us filled lives. I am tired of seeing Christians live without joy. I'm tired of sometimes seeing myself without joy. I'm tired of seeing Christians invest in weak and empty pastimes with no eternal significance. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't bring you closer to God. It doesn't add value to your eternal destiny. And it doesn't bring you joy. It just brings you happiness, which is temporary. And so Solomon concludes in chapter 12, verse 67, I read, remember him before the silver cord is severed, or the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, or the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Verse 13, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man.